Gustav II Adolf, widely known in English by his Latinized name Gustavus Adolphus or as Gustav II Adolf, or as Gustavus Adolphus the Great, was the King of Sweden from 1611 to 1632 and is credited as the founder of Sweden as a great power. He led Sweden to military supremacy during the 30 Years' War, helping to determine the political as well as the religious balance of power in Europe. He is often regarded as one of the greatest military commanders of all time, with innovative use of combined arms. His most notable military victory was the Battle of Breitenfeld. With a superb military machine with good weapons, excellent training, and effective field artillery, backed by an efficient government which could provide necessary funds, Gustavus Adolphus was poised to make himself a major European leader, but he was killed at the Battle of Lutsen in 1632. He was ably assisted in his efforts by Count Axel Oxenstierna, the Lord High Chancellor of Sweden, who also acted as regent after his death. In an era characterized by almost endless warfare, he led his armies as king from 1611 until his death in battle in 1632, while leading a charge as Sweden rose from the status of a mere regional power to one of the great powers of Europe and a model of early modern-era government. Within only a few years of his accession, Sweden had become the largest nation in Europe after Russia and Spain. Some have called him the father of modern warfare, or the first great modern general. Under his tutelage, Sweden and the Protestant cause developed a number of excellent commanders, such as Lennart Torstensson, who would go on to defeat Sweden's enemies and expand the boundaries and the power of the empire long after Gustavus Adolphus' death in battle. He was known by the epithets the Golden King and the Lion of the North by neighboring sovereigns. He made Sweden one of the great powers of Europe in part by reforming the administrative structure. For example, he began parish registration of the population, so that the central government could more efficiently tax and conscript the people. Historian Christer Jørgensen argues that his achievements in the field of economic reform, trade, modernization, and the creation of the modern bureaucratic autocracy was great as his exploits on the battlefields. His domestic reforms, which transformed a backward, almost medieval economy and society, were in fact the foundations, not only for his victories in Germany but absolutely crucial for the creation and survival of the Swedish Empire. Like Gustavus Adolphus was born in Stockholm as the oldest son of Duke Charles of the Vasa dynasty and his second wife, Christina of Holstein-Gottorp. At the time, the King of Sweden was Gustavus Adolphus, a cousin Sigismund. The staunch Protestant Duke Charles forced the Catholic Sigismund to let go of the throne of Sweden in 1599, a part of the preliminary religious strife before the 30 Years' War, and reigned as regent before taking the throne as Charles IX of Sweden in 1604. Crown Prince Gustav Adolf had Ganjefloda in Dalecarlia as a duchy from 1610. Upon his father's death in October 1611, a 16-year-old Gustavus inherited the throne, as well as an ongoing succession of occasionally belligerent dynastic disputes with his Polish cousin. Sigismund III wanted to regain the throne of Sweden and tried to force Gustavus Adolphus to renounce the title. In a round of this dynastic dispute, Gustavus invaded Livonia when he was 31, beginning the Polish-Swedish War. He intervened on behalf of the Lutherans in Germany, who opened the gates to the cities to him. His reign became famous from his actions a few years later when in June 1630 he landed in Germany, marking the Swedish intervention in the 30 Years' War. Gustavus intervened on the anti-imperial side, which at the time was losing to the Holy Roman Empire and its Catholic allies. The Swedish forces would quickly reverse that situation. Gustavus was married to Maria Eleonora of Brandenburg, the daughter of John Sigismund, Elector of Brandenburg, and chose the Prussian city of Elbing as the base for his operations in Germany. He died in the Battle of Lutsen in 1632. His early death was a great loss to the Lutheran side. This resulted in large parts of Germany and other countries which had been conquered for Lutheranism to be reconquered for Catholicism. His involvement in the 30 Years' War gave rise to the saying that he was the incarnation of the Lion of the North, or as it is called in German, der Löwe aus Mitternacht. Issue. Gustavus Adolphus created the modern Swedish Navy, which successfully transported troops and supplies to the continental battlefront. Military commander. Gustavus Adolphus was an extremely able military commander. His innovative tactical integration of infantry, cavalry, logistics and particularly his use of artillery, earned him the title of the "Father of Modern Warfare." Future commanders who studied and admired Gustav II Adolf include Napoleon I of France and Karl von Clausewitz. His advancements in military science made Sweden the dominant Baltic power for the next 100 years. He is also the only Swedish monarch to be styled the Great. This decision was made by the Swedish Estates of the Realm when they convened in 1633. Thus, by the decision, he is officially, to this day, to be called Gustav Adolf the Great. Gustavus Adolphus was the main figure responsible for the success of Swedish arms during the 30 Years' War and led his nation to great prestige. As a general, Gustavus Adolphus is famous for employing mobile artillery on the battlefield, as well as very aggressive tactics, where attack was stressed over defense, and mobility and cavalry initiative were emphasized. Among other innovations, he installed an early form of combined arms in his formations, where the cavalry could attack from the safety of an infantry line reinforced by cannon and retire again within to regroup after the foray. Inspired by the reform of Maurice of Nassau, he adopted much shallower infantry formations than were common in the pike and shot armies of the era, with formations typically fighting in 5 or 6 ranks, occasionally supported at some distance by another such formation, the gabs being the provinces of the artillery and cavalry as noted above. His artillery were themselves different. In addition to the usual complements of heavy cannon, he introduced light mobile guns for the first time into the Renaissance battlefield. These were grouped in batteries supporting his more linearly deployed formations, replacing the cumbersome and unmaneuverable traditional deep squares used in other pike and shot armies of the day. In consequence, his forces could redeploy and reconfigure very rapidly, confounding his enemies. Karl von Clausewitz and Napoleon Bonaparte considered him one of the greatest generals of all time, an evaluation agreed with by George S. Patton and others. He was also renowned for his constancy of purpose and the equality of his troops. No one part of his armies was considered better or received preferred treatment, as was common in other armies where the cavalry were the elite, followed by the artillery, and both disdained the lowly infantry. In Gustavus' army the units were extensively cross-trained. Both cavalry and infantry could service the artillery, as his heavy cavalry did when turning captured artillery on the opposing Catholic tertios at First Breitenfeld. Pikemen could shoot, if not as accurately as those designated musketeers, so a valuable firearm could be kept in the firing line. His infantrymen and gunners were taught to ride, if needed. Napoleon thought highly of the achievement, and copied the tactics. However, recent historians have challenged velocity reputation. B.H. Littlehart says it is an exaggeration to credit him with a uniquely disciplined conscript army, or call his the first military state to fight a protracted war on the continent. He argues that he improved existing techniques and used them brilliantly. Richard Brzezinski says his legendary state was based on inaccurate myths created by later historians. Many of his innovations were developed by his senior staff. Gustavus Adolphus was a very forward-thinking military man. He enthusiastically adopted a number of fairly new military innovations as the new standard for the Swedish army, which in the beginning came as a shock to his more conservative-minded opponents. While Gustavus has been widely credited for re-emphasizing the shock role of European cavalry, his innovations were hardly new. Huguenot cavalry under Henry IV and Gaspard II de Coligny having fought in exactly the same fashion during the French Wars of Religion. As a matter of fact, his opponent Johann Siklaus, Count of Tilly, also favored the same ferocious charges the Swedish cavalry would become famous for. Neither was the Swedish practice of integrating shot and horse, the so-called commanded shot, a new one, with the Huguenot horsemen at the Battle of Coutras having the same supporting shooters. What made the Swedish army unique in this regard was the fact that the use of commanded shot became the standard tactical doctrine of its horse, and this in turn was adopted by other armies of the period, including its imperial opponents and that of the English Civil War. Adolphus better deserved the credit of introducing a standard caliber light muskets to his infantry forces, replacing the previous mix of arquebus and heavy musket common in imperial tertios. The shallower infantry formation of the Swedish brigade, much more conducive to massed firepower, was inspired by the work of Morris. However, Adolphus perfected the system and introduced the use of salvo fire, where 2 or 3 ranks of musketeers fired simultaneously, usually at point-blank range, rather than one rank at a time counter-marching as was common in that era. The Swedish salve was much more effective at breaking the enemy's miral and repulsing cavalry charges than the earlier method. Perhaps Adolphus' greatest contribution, however, was his work in field artillery, equipping each of his brigades with up to 12 light regimental guns. He greatly increased the organic firepower of his infantry and for the first time allowed the artillery arm to play a role in the offensive instead of being a static spectator in a battle of maneuvers. Political reforms. Gustav II Adolph's politics in the conquered territory of Estonia also show progressive tendencies. In 1631 he forced the nobility to grant the peasants greater autonomy. He also encouraged education, opening a school in Tallinn in 1631, today known as Gustav Adolf Grammar School, on the 30th of June 1632. Gustav II Adolf signed the foundation decree of Academia Dorpatensis in Estonia, today known as the University of Tartu, with policies that supported the common people. The period of Swedish rule over Estonia, initiated by Gustav II Adolf and continued by his successors, is popularly known by Estonians as the Good Old Swedish Times. On the 27th of August 1617, he spoke before his coronation, and his words included these: "I had carefully learned to understand, about that experience which I could have upon things of rule, how fortune is failing a great subject to such rule in common, so that otherwise I would have had scant reason to desire such a rule, had I not found myself obliged to it through God's bidding and nature. Now it was of my acquaintance, that, inasmuch as God had let me be born a prince, such as I then am born, then my good and my destruction were knotted into one with the common good. For every reason then, it was now my promise that I should take great pains about the well-being and good governance and management, and thereabout bear close concern." Military commander Gustavus Adolphus inherited 3 wars from his father when he ascended the throne: against Denmark, which had attacked Sweden earlier in 1611, against Russia, due to Sweden having tried to take advantage of the Russian time of troubles, and against Poland, due to King Charles's having deposed King Sigismund III, his nephew, as King of Sweden. The war against Denmark was concluded in 1613 with a peace that did not cost Sweden any territory, but it was forced to pay a heavy indemnity to Denmark. During this war, Gustavus Adolphus let his soldiers plunder towns and villages, and as he met little resistance from Danish forces in Scania, they pillaged and devastated 24 Scanian parishes. His memory in Scania has been negative because of that fear. The war against Russia ended in 1617 with the Treaty of Stolbovo, which excluded Russia from the Baltic Sea. The final inherited war, the war against Poland, ended in 1629 with the Truce of Altynmark, which transferred the large province Livonia to Sweden and freed the Swedish forces for the subsequent intervention in the 30 Years' War in Germany, where Swedish forces had already established a bridgehead in 1628. Especially the weak electorate of Brandenburg was torn apart by a quarrel between the Protestant and Catholic parties. The Brandenburg minister and diplomat Baron Samuel von Winterfeld influenced Gustavus Adolphus to support and protect the Protestant side in Germany. When Gustavus Adolphus began his push into northern Germany in June to July 1630, he had just 4,000 troops, but he was soon able to consolidate the Protestant position in the north, using reinforcements from Sweden and money supplied by France at the Treaty of Boerwalde. After Swedish plundering in Brandenburg endangered the system of retrieving war contributions from occupied territories, marauding and plundering by Swedish soldiers was prohibited. Meanwhile, a Catholic army under Johann Siklaus, Count of Tilly, was laying waste to Saxony. Gustavus Adolphus met Tilly's army and crushed it at the First Battle of Breitenfeld in September 1631. He then marched clear across Germany, establishing his winter quarters near the Rhine, making plans for the invasion of the rest of the Holy Roman Empire. In March 1632, Gustavus Adolphus invaded Bavaria, a staunch ally of the emperor. He forced the withdrawal of his Catholic opponents at the Battle of Rhein. This would mark the high point of the campaign. In the summer of that year, he sought a political solution that would preserve the existing structure of states in Germany, while guaranteeing the security of its Protestants. But achieving these objectives depended on his continued success on the battlefield. Gustavus is reported to have entered battle without wearing any armor, proclaiming, "The Lord God is my armor." Quote, "It is more likely that he simply wore a leather cuirass rather than going into battle wearing no battle protection whatsoever." In 1627, near Diershaw in Prussia, a Polish soldier shot him in the muscles above his shoulders. He survived, but the doctors could not remove the bullet, so from that point on, he could not wear iron armor. 2 fingers of his right hand were paralyzed. Death. The Battle of Lutsen was one of the most decisive battles of the 30 Years' War. It was a Protestant victory, but the Protestant alliance lost one of its most important leaders, which caused the Protestant campaign to lose direction. Gustavus Adolphus was killed when at a crucial point in the battle. He became separated from his troops while leading a cavalry charge on this wing. Towards 1 p.m., in the thick mix of gun smoke and fog covering the field, the king was separated from his fellow riders and suffered multiple shots. A bullet crushed his left arm below the elbow. Almost simultaneously, his horse suffered a shot to the neck that made it hard to control. In the mix of fog and smoke from the burning town of Lutsen, the king rode astray behind enemy lines. There he sustained yet another shot in the back, was stabbed and fell from his horse. Lying on the ground, he received a final, fatal shot to the temple. His fate remained unknown for some time. However, when the gunnery paused and the smoke cleared, his horse was spotted between the two lines. Gustavus himself not on it and nowhere to be seen. His disappearance stopped the initiative of the hitherto successful Swedish right wing. While a search was conducted, his partly stripped body was found an hour or two later, and was secretly evacuated from the field in a Swedish artillery wagon. After his death, Gustavus's wife initially kept his body, and later his heart, in the castle of Nyköping for over a year. His remains now rest in Riddarholm Church in Stockholm. Aftermath. In February 1633, following the death of the king, the Swedish Riksdag of the Estates decided that his name would be styled Gustav Adolf the Great. No such honor has been bestowed on any other Swedish monarch before or since. The crown of Sweden was inherited in the Vasa family, and from Charles IX's time excluded those Vasa princes who had been traitors or descended from deposed monarchs. Gustavus Adolphus, a younger brother, had died 10 years before, and therefore there was only the king's daughter left as a female heir. Maria Eleonora and the king's ministers took over the government on behalf of Gustavus Adolphus' underage daughter Christina upon her father's death. He left one other known child, his illegitimate son Gustav, Count of Vasaborg. Memorials. Gustavus Adolphus is commemorated today with city squares in major Swedish cities like Stockholm, Gothenburg and Helsingborg. The Gustav Adolf work of the Evangelical Church in Germany, founded on the bicentennial celebration of the Battle of Lutsen, has as its object the aid of feeble sister churches and commemorates the king's legacy. Swedish royalty visited the GOR headquarters in Leipzig on the festivities of Gustavus Adolphus' 400th birthday, in 1994. Gustavus Adolphus College, a Lutheran college in St. Peter, Minnesota, is also named for the Swedish king. Evaluations. The Columbia Encyclopedia sums up his record in military organization and strategy. Gustavus was ahead of his time. While most powers relied on mercenary troops, he organized a national standing army that distinguished itself by its discipline and relatively high moral standards. Deeply religious, the king desired his soldiers to behave like a truly Christian army. His stern measures against the common practices of looting, raping, and torture were effective until his death. His successes were due to this discipline, his use of small, mobile units, the superiority of his firearms, and his personal charisma. Although he was deeply interested in the internal progress of his kingdom, much of the credit for the development of Swedish industry and the fiscal and administrative reforms of his reign belongs to Oxenstierna. The German socialist Franz Mehring wrote a biography of Gustavus Adolphus with a Marxist perspective on the actions of the Swedish king during the 30 Years' War. In it, he makes a case that the war was fought over economics and trade rather than religion. The Swedes discovered huge deposits of copper, which were used to build brass cannon. The cottage industrial growth stimulated an armaments industry. In his book, Offredshar, the Swedish historian and author Peter England argues that there was probably no single all-important reason for the king's decision to go to war. Instead, it was likely a combination of religious, security, as well as economic considerations. This view was supported by German historian Johannes Burchard, who writes that Gustavus entered the 30 Years' War exactly 100 years after the publication of the Confessio Augustana. the core confession of faith of the Lutheran Church, and let himself be praised as its savior. Yet Gustavus' own manifesto of war does not mention any religious motivations at all, but speaks of political and economical reasons. Sweden would have to maintain its integrity in the face of several provocations and aggressions by the Habsburgian Empire. The manifesto was written by scholar Johann Adler Salvius in a style common of the time that promotes a just war. Picardet argues that traditional Swedish historiography constructed a defensive interest in security out of that by taking the manifesto's text for granted. But to defend Stockholm, the occupation of the German Baltic territories would have been an extreme advance, and the Imperial Baltic Sea fleet mentioned as a threat in the manifesto had never reached more than a quarter of the size of the Swedish fleet. Moreover, it was never maintained to challenge Sweden but to face the separatist Netherlands. So if ruling the Baltic Sea was a goal of Swedish strategy, the conquests in Germany were not a defensive war but an act of expansion. From Swedish Finland, Gustavus advanced along the Baltic Sea coast and eventually to Augsburg and Munich, and he even urged the Swiss Confederacy to join him. This was no longer about Baltic interests but the imperial capital of Vienna and the Alpine passes that were now in close reach of the Swedish army. Picardet points out that the Gothic legacy of the Swedes coalesced as a political program. The Swedish king was also Rex Gotorum, and the list of kings was traced back to the Gothic rulers to construct continuity. Prior to his embarkment to northern Germany, Gustavus urged the Swedish nobility to follow the example of conquests set by the Gothic ancestors. Had he lived longer, it would have been likely that Gustavus had reached out for the imperial crown of the Holy Roman Empire. Timeline: December 1594. Gustavus is born in the castle of Träkrona, Sweden. October 1611. Gustavus gains the Swedish throne and 3 wars after his father, Charles IX's death. February 1612. The Battle of Lutsen against Denmark, where Gustavus almost drowns. January 1613. Gustavus negotiates peace after repulsing the Danish invasion in the Kalmar War with the status quo antebellum. However, a ransom has to be paid for Alvsborg fortress. February 1617. After the pressures of Gustavus' siege of Pskov, he excludes Russia from the Baltic Sea in the Ingrian War, who cedes Ingria to Sweden. November 1620. Gustav Adolf marries Maria Eleonora. January 1626. The Battle of Walhof, where Gustavus successfully uses effective cooperation between infantry and cavalry. July 1626. Gustavus Adolphus and his army disembark at Pilor, Prussia, during the Polish-Swedish War. September 1626. Gustavus defeats a Polish force of Sigismund III Vasa in the Battle of Niev. December 1626. Daughter and successor Christina is born. May 1627. Gustavus is shot and seriously wounded in the assault on Danzig. August 1627. The king is seriously wounded in the Battle of Deer Shore, after being shot twice. June 1629. His troops meet up with forces of Polish Crown Field Hetman Stanislaw Konispolski and imperial troops under Hans-Georg von Arnim-Beutzenberg in the Battle of Trzciana, and the Gustavus is almost killed and captured twice. September 1629. Truce of Altmark, Livonia and Estonia is ceded to Sweden as a result of Gustavus' Polish wars. May 1630 and the 6th of July Gustav Adolf lands in Germany to enter the 30 Years' War. April 1631. Gustavus besieges and captures the town of Frankfurt an der Oder in the war. July 1631. Werben, first major field battle between Swedish and Catholic forces where Gustavus is victorious. September 1631. At the Battle of Breitenfeld, Gustavus Adolphus decisively defeats the Catholic forces led by Tilly, even after the Allied Protestant Saxon army had been routed and fled with the baggage train. April 1632. At the Battle of Lech, Gustavus Adolphus defeats Tilly once more, and in the battle Tilly sustains a fatal wound. May 1632. Munich yields to the Swedish army. September 1632. Gustavus Adolphus attacks the stronghold of Alta Vest, which is under the command of Wallenstein, but is repulsed, marking the first defeat in the 30 Years' War of the previously invincible Swedes. November 1632. At the Battle of Lutsen, Gustavus Adolphus is killed in action, but the Swedes win the fight thanks to Bernhard of Saxe-Weimar, who assumes command and defeats Wallenstein. The Swedish war effort was kept up by generals Gustav Horn, Johan van Eekhuitar, Lennart Torstensson, Carl Gustaf Wrangel and Chancellor Axel Oxenstierna until the Peace of Westphalia. A History of Gustavus Adolphus Wars was written by Johann Philipp Bolin.